The Constitution names the Vice President of the United States as the President of the Senate. In addition to serving as presiding officer, the Vice President has the sole power to break a tie vote in the Senate and formally presides over the receiving and counting of electoral ballots cast in presidential elections. Today Vice Presidents serve as principal advisors to the President, but from 1789 until the 1950s their primary duty was to preside over the Senate. Since the 1830s, Vice Presidents have occupied offices near the Senate chamber. Over the course of the nation's history, the Vice President's influence evolved as Vice Presidents and Senators experimented with, and at times vigorously debated, the role to be played by this constitutional officer. Although the position of Vice President did not exist under the Continental Congresses or the Articles of Confederation, the framers of the Constitution drew on precedents from state governments to establish the position in the new federal government. Prior to the Revolution, lieutenant governors presided over the governors' councils of the royal colonies, which also functioned as upper houses of the legislatures. This system was adapted in some states after the Revolution, such as in New York, where the lieutenant governor presided over the state senate. To some of the framers, assigning the vice president to be president of the Senate violated the concept of separation of powers. Elbridge Gerry, who would later serve as vice president, declared that the framers might as well put the president himself as head of the legislature. As it turned out, prior to the 20th century vice presidents rarely attended cabinet meetings or otherwise involved themselves in executive branch business. The degree to which vice presidents were engaged in Senate activity varied throughout the 19th century. John Adams played an active role, lobbying senators to vote against legislation he opposed and frequently lecturing senators on procedural and policy matters. Thomas Jefferson devoted his 4-year term to preparing his Manual of Parliamentary Practice, which he hoped would allow him and his successors to preside over the Senate with fairness, intelligence, and consistency. John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, who served as vice president under both John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson, took an active role in Senate business. A scrupulous guardian of the Senate's written rules, he disliked the deference given to its unwritten customs and practices. Some vice presidents, such as George M. Dallas, Levi P. Morton, and Garrett A. Hobart, studied the Senate's rules and precedents and presided most effectively. Others were less engaged with the daily work of the Senate. Henry Wilson, who served as Ulysses S. Grant's second vice president, wrote a 3-volume history of the opposition to slavery during his tenure, which was cut short when he died in his Capitol office in 1875. The vice presidency in the 19th century seldom led to the White House. Of the 21 individuals who held that office from 1805 to 1899, only Martin Van Buren was subsequently elected president. 4 others succeeded to the presidency when the incumbent died, none of whom later won election. The vice presidency shifted dramatically in the middle of the 20th century from being mainly a legislative position to a predominantly executive branch post. Calvin Coolidge was the first vice president to be invited by the president to attend cabinet meetings. As modern-era presidents increasingly sought to set legislative agendas, their vice presidents received additional executive assignments. Vice presidents represented their president's administrations on Capitol Hill, served on the National Security Council, chaired special commissions, acted as high-level representatives of the government to foreign heads of state, and assumed countless other roles at the president's direction. Beginning with Lyndon B. Johnson, each vice president has occupied spacious quarters in the executive office building and assembled staffs of specialists to extend their reach and influence. In 1969, President Richard M. Nixon pledged to give his vice president a significant policy-making role and for the first time an office in the White House itself. Walter F. Mondale expanded the vice president's role as presidential advisor, establishing the tradition of weekly lunches with the president. Subsequent vice presidents have continued to be active participants in their administrations and have only presided over the Senate for special occasions such as the opening session of a Congress when senators-elect are sworn into office or to break a tie vote. Election and succession. The Constitution's framers provided that the vice president would be elected at the same time and for the same term as the president. They created an indirect election through the Electoral College. Under the original system, each member of the Electoral College voted for two persons for president, with the candidate receiving the most electoral votes, and at least a majority, becoming president, and the candidate receiving the second highest number of votes becoming vice president. The framers did not foresee that candidates would run as a ticket under the banner of a political party. In 1800, both Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, representing the Democratic Republicans, campaigned for president and vice president respectively and received the same number of electoral votes, which sent the contest to the House of Representatives. After 35 unsuccessful ballots, the House finally elected Jefferson president, thus making Aaron Burr the third vice president. Nearly 4 years later, to avoid a repeat of the 1800 fiasco, Congress passed and the necessary number of states ratified the 12th Amendment to the Constitution, allowing electors to cast separate ballots for president and for vice president. If no vice presidential candidate receives an electoral college majority, the amendment allows the Senate to decide between the two highest vote getters. In 1837, Richard M. Johnson became the first, and to date only, vice president to be elected under the provisions of this amendment. Notably, the Constitution did not provide for any method of replacing the vice president should he or she resign, die in office, or succeed to the presidency, but it did provide that in the absence of the vice president, the Senate could choose a president pro tempore meaning for the time being in Latin, to perform the duties of the chair. Prior to 1967, during the 16 periods when the nation did not have a vice president, the Senate's president pro tempore effectively served as the acting vice president, receiving the vice president's salary and carrying out all duties of the office, except for breaking tie votes in the Senate. In 1967, the ratification of the 25th Amendment allowed the president to name a new vice president with the approval of both houses of Congress. The stories of the individuals who have served as vice president illustrate the changing character of the office. Most vice presidents have brought to the office significant public service experience, including as members of Congress or state governors. Some came to their role as president of the Senate already familiar with the body, having served as U.S. senators. Several vice presidents later returned to serve again in the Senate, among them former President Andrew Johnson. Two vice presidents, George Clinton and John C. Calhoun, held the office under two different presidents. Of the 15 vice presidents who went on to become president, 8 succeeded to the office on the death of a president, and 4 of these were later elected president. 2 vice presidents, Hannibal Hamlin and Henry Wallace, were dropped from the ticket after their first term, only to see their successors become president months after taking office when the president died. Similarly, when Spiro Agnew resigned, he was replaced under the provisions of the 25th Amendment by Gerald R. Ford, who then became president when Richard M. Nixon resigned less than a year later. 1 Jefferson ran against Adams for president. Since he received the second highest electoral vote, he automatically became vice president under the system that existed at the time. 2 Republican refers to 2 different parties widely separated in time, Jeffersonian Republicans of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and the present Republican Party, which was founded in the 1850s. The service dates should make clear which of the 2 parties is intended. 3 In the nation's early years, electors did not differentiate between their votes for president and vice president, and the runner-up for president became vice president. In 1800, Jefferson and Burr each received 73 electoral votes, thus sending the election to the House of Representatives, which selected Jefferson as president. Burr automatically became vice president. This stalemate led to adoption of the 12th Amendment to the Constitution in 1804. 4 George Clinton died in office April 20, 1812, and the vice presidency remained vacant until 1813. 5 Elbridge Gerry died in office November 23, 1814, and the vice presidency remained vacant until 1817. 6 By 1820 the Federalist Party was defunct, and a period of party realignment began that continued until 1840 when the Whig and Democratic parties became established. In the interim, party affiliations underwent considerable flux. For much of that time, the split fell between the supporters and opponents of Andrew Jackson. The pro-Jackson forces evolved into the Democratic Party, while those opposing Jackson eventually coalesced into the Whig Party. All the presidential candidates in 1824 were Republicans, although of varying persuasions, and Calhoun had support for the vice presidency from both the Adams and Jackson camps. As no presidential candidate received the necessary majority of electoral votes, the House of Representatives made the decision. Calhoun, however, received a clear majority, 182 of 260, of the vice presidential electoral votes. John C. Calhoun resigned on December 28, 1832, and the vice presidency remained vacant until 1833. The Democratic Party was not yet formally created during Jackson's 2 terms as president, but developed later from his supporters. Since no vice presidential candidate received a majority of the electoral vote in the 1836 election, the U.S. Senate elected Richard M. Johnson as vice president on February 8, 1837. Johnson's election is the only time the Senate has exercised this constitutional authority, granted by the 12th Amendment, which provides, if no person have a majority, then from the 2 highest numbers on the list, the Senate shall choose the vice president. Although Tyler ran on the Whig ticket, he remained a Democrat throughout his life. John Tyler succeeded to the presidency on April 6, 1841, vice presidency remained vacant until 1845. Millard Fillmore succeeded to the presidency on July 10, 1850, and the vice presidency remained vacant until 1853. William Rufus King died in office on April 18, 1853, and the vice presidency remained vacant until 1857. Johnson was a war Democrat, who ran on a fusion ticket with Republican President Abraham Lincoln. Andrew Johnson succeeded to the presidency on April 15, 1865, and the vice presidency remained vacant until 1869. Henry Wilson died in office on November 22, 1875, and the vice presidency remained vacant until 1877. Chester A. Arthur succeeded to the presidency on September 20, 1881, and the vice presidency remained vacant until 1885. Thomas A. Hendricks died in office on November 25, 1885, and the vice presidency remained vacant until 1889. Garrett A. Hobart died in office on November 21, 1899, and the vice presidency remained vacant until 1901. Theodore Roosevelt succeeded to the presidency on September 14, 1901, and the vice presidency remained vacant until 1905. James S. Sherman died in office on October 30, 1912, and the vice presidency remained vacant until 1913. Calvin Coolidge succeeded to the presidency on August 3, 1923, and the vice presidency remained vacant until 1925. Harry S. Truman succeeded to the presidency on April 12, 1945, and the vice presidency remained vacant until 1949. Lyndon B. Johnson succeeded to the presidency on November 22, 1963, and the vice presidency remained vacant until 1965. Spiro T. Agnew resigned on October 10, 1973, and the vice presidency remained vacant until December 6, 1973. Lyndon Johnson's succession to the presidency in 1963 following the assassination of John F. Kennedy left the vice presidency vacant for the 16th time in U.S. history. To avoid such a vacancy in the future, Congress passed and the states ratified the 25th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in 1967, allowing for the appointment and confirmation of a new vice president if such a vacancy occurs. Gerald Ford became the first vice president to be nominated by the president and confirmed by the Congress pursuant to the 25th Amendment. Ford took the oath of office as vice president on December 6, 1973, and served until August 9, 1974, when he succeeded to the presidency. 28 Gerald R. Ford succeeded to the presidency on August 9, 1974, and the vice presidency remained vacant until December 19, 1974. 29 Following succession to the presidency after the resignation of Richard Nixon in 1974, Gerald Ford nominated Nelson Rockefeller as vice president, as prescribed by the 25th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Rockefeller took the oath of office in the Senate chamber on December 19, 1974. Television cameras that had been recently installed in the Senate chamber in anticipation of a possible impeachment trial of Richard Nixon were instead used to televise the swearing-in of Vice President Rockefeller. This marked the first time television cameras had been allowed in the Senate chamber. Thank you for watching this video.